Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome back. It's nice to have you. I hope everybody had a good break, a good Valentine's Day, and we are good to go with a great guest speaker. But before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few reminders for Zoom meetings. If everybody could put your audio on mute and unmute when you are asking a question. When we come to questions, we prefer that you type them in the chat function of Zoom, and our guest speaker will address those then. And one of the training team will also let our guest speaker, Matthew, know that there's a question in the chat. He will try to answer those in the moment, if not after his sections in his presentation. Also, yeah, we talked about chat and just stay on topic. So that's it for Zoom etiquette. After the presentation today, we ask that you please stay on. We have a few items for your intern class business and also reminders about the nature walk afterwards at 12 noon. Uh, I think that's about it for reminders. Matthew, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about your
Yeah.
background, and we'll get started. Thanks for joining.
All right. I just want to make sure y'all can still see my screen, right? The presentation.
You're good.
Okay. Good deal. All right. Well, thank y'all for having me today. Like they said, my name's Matthew March. I am the agent in Waller County, so I'm a little bit to the west and south of y'all. I'm the ag agent here in Waller County. I don't have a master naturalist chapter in Waller County, but I used to have one previous to being in Waller County. I was the ag agent in Polk County, so kind of north and east of y'all, and I worked a lot with the Piney Woods chapter over there. So I always have enjoyed talking to master naturalists. I like wildlife and habitat and stuff like that. So I've always enjoyed talking to y'all, and if y'all have any questions, like I said, just put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer. We'll catch it at some point. Um, yeah, so we'll get started with today's talk. Um, I know Zoom is probably not the most exciting format, but I know that works good for y'all. Plus, I appreciate not having to drive somewhere on a Saturday morning, but I'll try to make this talk as fun as we can make it. This is a topic that I enjoy a lot, and I think it's very important for y'all as master naturalists to understand because it's one thing to be like, oh, we like the trees out there, or we like the plants or the animals, but I think as a master naturalist, especially when you're going through this training class, it's important to understand what we have in Texas and why we have it. So when we start looking at ecological regions, so why do we have plants and animals and certain rocks in certain places of the state? That's going to affect our management and how we manage the resources and then issues that we have in that part of the state. So we'll go through the whole state, and I hope y'all enjoy this talk as much as I enjoy giving it. I'm kind of, I don't want to say, I don't know what the good word is for it, but like when I travel across the state or really travel anywhere, I always have to like try to figure out, okay, what ecoregion am I in? Why does it look like this? Why are we growing this crop here compared to growing another crop somewhere else? Why do we have this type of deer here, but in this part of the state we have a different type of deer? So I hope as we go through this today, it kind of explains that a little bit more, and y'all can take this and use this for good and help educate other people. So with that being said, I've given this talk many a times, and I always think 2 hours are way too much, but I usually up running out of time at the end, so hopefully we don't do that today. Uh, but the first part of the presentation is a little bit boring. It's a lot of I guess descriptions and definitions and kind of getting the background of what an ecoregion is. But after that, I promise the last two-thirds of the presentation is a lot less words and a lot more pictures. And we're going to take a road trip across Texas, basically. So starting out, what is an ecoregion? So it's kind of a broad definition. So I pulled up, let me see, we got 5 different sources here, all the way from Google to the U.S. Forest Service on what an ecoregion is. Um, so it depending on the source is going to kind of depend on the definition, and the reasoning for that is because an ecoregion is basically an area of like things or area of similar characteristics, I guess you could say. So if you're looking at it from a geological standpoint, or let's say you're a geologist, you're going to define your ecoregions more as on a geological time scale. So maybe how the rocks came to be in that area, or maybe an area that has a bunch of limestone versus an area that has a bunch of granite in the ground. Uh, Maybe you look more at water. So if you're more like a hydrologist, you're going to be looking at maybe more on a watershed standpoint. But for today's talk, we're going to be looking more on basically animals and plants, so flora and fauna. So y'all can kind of read through this and look at the different definitions. I'm not going to read them all, but like I said, ecoregion is an area of similar characteristics and is more alike in this area compared to another area. So when we look at drivers of ecoregions, so what creates those plants and animals? Again, you can define ecoregions kind of as different aspects, but for today's talk, we're going to be looking at flora and fauna, so plants and animals, mostly because I think that's what y'all enjoy the most. And personally, that's what I enjoy the most. I'm a wildlife biologist by education, I guess you could say. So, and plus being an ag agent, um, plants are going to affect us a lot also. So when we look at drivers of ecoregions, why do we have those plants? Why do we have those animals in a certain space? Here's the different drivers, but I bolded the top two: temperature and precipitation. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it. When you think about a basic food chain, you got your plants at the bottom, then you got your herbivores, then you got your predators on top. So obviously, temperature and precipitation is going to affect what kind of plants you have. The hotter it is, you're going to have more plants that are adapted to tropical environments compared to colder environments. More rain, you're going to get a rainforest versus no rain, you're going to get a desert. Uh, but we'll touch more on temperature and precipitation here in a little bit because those are probably the two biggest driving factors of the eco regions when we get down here to Texas. But we're going to touch base on these other ones really quick. So soils, obviously different soils are going to grow different plants. Hydrology, we mentioned that already, watersheds. If you're in an area where there's a large aquifer, we'll use like Central Texas for an example. Most of y'all probably know there's a lot of springs in Central Texas due to the aquifer that's close to underground. So your hydrology there is gonna have springs, which is gonna affect your unique animals. Geography, obviously, mountains versus plains. A lot of this is pretty basic. Altitude, that's one that you don't think of a lot. Uh, but that's going to come into play here in Texas, and we'll talk about that more when we start talking about the mountains out in West Texas. But just a couple thousand, you might have a 1,000 or a 2 foot thousand mountain range surrounded by a very low dry area. Well, just that little bit of difference in altitude by maybe 500, 1,000, 2,000 feet is going to cause it to be a little bit cooler, have a little bit more moisture, and that's going to affect your plant and your animal life. And we will see that when we start talking about the ecoregions out in far west Texas. Uh, Macroclimate and oceans kind of go hand in hand. So what I mean by that is, if you look at North America on a large scale, obviously the further you get away from the coast, the more inland it is. So it's less affected by the how oceans tend to modify the extremes of temperature and precipitation. Obviously, the closer you are to the ocean, y'all can probably attest this. Living in Southeast Texas, our temperatures here are pretty stable and pretty humid. But even when you look at areas, we'll just say, the north coast of Alaska next to the Arctic Ocean, that 50 miles or so next to the Arctic Ocean has a more moderated temperature than areas 300 miles into the interior of Alaska. Now, give it next to the Arctic Ocean in Alaska. I actually looked this up yesterday because I was just curious how cold it was in Alaska. It's negative 30 next to the coast, but it's negative 60 for a low next inland. So, I mean, it's still cold, but next to an ocean, or when you're talking about large continent scale, you're going to have impacts there for temperature and precipitation. And I hope that all made sense. It's kind of just hitting it on the broad scale, but I think most of y'all can probably grasp those concepts pretty easily. So let's dive into precipitation and temperature. Uh, I show this map, and when I do this presentation, I always think this kind of makes sense to a lot of people, or maybe don't under. I always think a lot of people understand the vast gradient between precipitation and temperature in Texas. But then I know we have a lot of new transplants here, and a lot of y'all might be always just lived around Houston and urban areas, and you never really thought about it too much. So we'll look at this for a little bit. Uh, Tend to when I guess you're dealing with agriculture, like in my job, or if you're being a wildlife biologist, we think about the precipitation and temperature gradients in Texas more than someone that's not, I guess, in those fields. So we'll look at this. Here's a precipitation map of Texas. I think everyone knows it rains more in the east part of Texas than it does in the west, but we have one of the most highest gradient of rainfalls in probably the U.S. I don't even think that's probably a question. I'm just thinking out loud what other states might have this broad of range. Maybe Washington or Oregon with the coastal forest up there in their high desert, but even then they're going to get more than 8 inches of rainfall that we get out in El Paso a year. And when you talk about 8 inches of rainfall out in El Paso, that might come in one rainfall or maybe two, and then it might not rain for another year and a half, 2 years. So, and you get that kind of all across Texas. It's either kind of boom or bust. There's kind of a saying in agriculture in Texas, we're in a constant drought that's just interrupted by short periods of flooding. So, we're almost always in a drought in Texas to some degree. I mean, for y'all that don't know, right now, I looked yesterday. I'm not sure if Montgomery County is, but parts of Waller County are in severe drought, which is only one category away from the highest drought category. But anyway, kind of focusing in on the other end of the spectrum in southeast Texas, we're pushing 60 inches of rain, and that's mainly going to be in deep southeast Texas around Beaumont, south of Jasper, that kind of area. So east of Houston and east of y'all. So we have an east to west gradient of rainfall. So the other end of that scale is going to be our temperature gradient, and that's going to go north to south. So if any of y'all are master gardeners in this call, y'all probably recognized this map before. This is a USDA hardiness zone map. But for y'all that don't, I'll touch on it really quick. Basically, it's telling you the temperatures in that zone can get down to that cold in the wintertime. And if you're going to plant something outside, you should expect it should be able to survive temperatures down to this zone. If not, you're going to have to cover it or bring it inside. So we'll just touch on this real quick. In the far northern part of the panhandle, you can get temperatures down to negative 10 degrees in the wintertime. Now, does that happen every winter? No, but it does happen, on a fairly regular basis. Compare that down to the valley in deep South Texas, down around Brownsville, where you might not even get temperatures barely below freezing. So when you're comparing the panhandle to the valley, it's almost like comparing subtropical Central America to the Midwest. I mean, and you see that in the plants and the animals and even in the crops we grow there. We grow wheat in the panhandle, which is something that you grow in the Dakotas and in the Midwest, compared to in the valley, we grow fruit trees. So or not fruit trees, citrus, I mean. So we got that gradient there. One other thing I want to point out is let's focus on Montgomery County. We'll see. My pointer's still working. I think y'all can see this. So we'll highlight Montgomery and Walker County on here, north of Harris County. So what color are y'all in? So you're going to be in this 8A or 8B, mostly 8B. This map is a little outdated. They actually updated this a few years ago due to the fact that we're having warmer winters. And so that 9A to the south of Montgomery County has kind of moved up actually into Montgomery County and pretty much all of Harris County. But what I want to point out is, because most of y'all are still going to be in 8B that are listening to this call, is 20 to 15 degrees is how cold you should expect it to get in the wintertime. So just like a few weeks ago when everyone says we were having this out of the norm cold blast, which it was colder than normal, it wasn't out of the range of what to be expected. So for y'all that were around here in 2021, if you remember when we had that bad winter storm there and we got down into the mid to low teens in our area, that really wasn't out of what could possibly happen. So that's just something I like to point out because I think as our winters have gotten warmer and as we've had more and more people move here that haven't lived here for a long time, and we kind of get, I guess, normalized to what these more milder winters. And when we do have these very short cold snaps, we like to think it's something out of the norm. Well, it's really not. It's just going back to what is possible. So I will move on to that. Other than for this talk, kind of my little high horse there on the side, I guess. But for this talk, all you got to know is that we have a north to south temperature gradient, which I think most people know. So if I was doing this talk in person, I would now ask y'all, what do you think Texas is? So where do we fit in the United States of America? And I'll just go through this and y'all can kind of think to yourself. Are we a southern state? You know, here around Houston, we like to say we're in the South. Are we a western state? I mean, we are pretty west in the country, especially when you consider this area out here in the far west Trans-Pecos area. I mean, we're El Paso's over halfway to California when you compare it to the eastern side of Texas. I mean, when you just look at here where El Paso is, it's farther west than Denver up here. Um, are we a Midwest state? I mean, when you get up here to the Panhandle, I mean, we're not that far from Missouri and Iowa. Uh, so, what do y'all think Texas is? And that's kind of an open-ended question. There's really not a right answer, but what I'm going to say is, if y'all ever heard the saying, where we're kind of the Lone Star State, and we like to brag and we like to say Texas is like its own other country because we're like no other state. And that really is true when it comes down to ecoregions. We have a lot of characteristics with the South and the Southeast. We have a lot of characteristics with the plains and the Midwest. We have a lot of characteristics with the West, the Western United States, and the Intermountain West and the Desert Southwest. So we're really like no other state in this country. So before we dive in into the ecoregions of Texas, which is what y'all are here today, we're going to zoom out a little bit and go on a wider scale. So this is going to be a map of the biomes of the world. And basically a biome is an ecoregion just on a very larger scale. So what I mean about that is when you think of biomes, it's probably a word y'all heard before. So let's use the Arctic for an example. So the Arctic tundra is going to be this kind of light greenish blue up here in the northern parts of the globe. The Arctic tundra in Russia or Siberia is going to be a different ecoregion than the Arctic tundra in Alaska and Canada. But on a larger scale, when we're looking at a biome of the world, so like areas, the tundra biome in Canada is going to be pretty similar to in Siberia and Russia and northern Norway and Finland. Um, so, it's a cold climate, doesn't get a lot of rainfall. Most of it's in snow, if it gets any snow at all, not much trees. So, a biome is just on a larger scale than an ecoregion. But what I want to show y'all is let's look down to Texas here. And so for this map, and I don't remember where I got it from, I put this presentation together probably 6, 7 years ago at this point. But when you look at Texas, how many colors do we have in there? So Texas has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Six. We have six major biomes, according to this map, that intersect in Texas. And just think about that when you look at other countries. Look at Europe as a whole. What do we got? About four or five colors here in Europe on the whole continent. So, mainland Europe has just as much, if not less, biomes than we find here in Texas as far as diversity and number. So we'll come back here to the United States. When you look at the lower 48, there's really no other state that even compares in Alaska on that point, too, that compares with the number of biomes that we have here in Texas. And that's going to relate to directly the number of ecoregions we have. So we have a very diverse biomes and very diverse ecosystems here in Texas. So here's another map. It's a little bit different biomes uh, classification, but this one zooms in straight on North America. And again, to kind of drive that point home, when you're looking at the other states and really, I guess you could say the rest of the North America continent, Texas in this map has one, two, three, four, five. It has five different biomes that intersect in Texas. So we have the piney woods or the evergreen forest to the south in the southeast that goes all the way up to New Jersey and just south of New York. We have that oak wood, hardwoods that we see a lot in the center part of the country around Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky. That comes down here into this mid-belt, middle third of Texas. Then obviously we have our Great Plains, which make up a lot of the whole of Texas. Um, and then in the far west, we have the desert southwest, but we also, as you can see, my red pointer kind of covers it up. But we have a little bit of this gray color here, which is actually, we have some mountain ranges that get high enough in the far west part of Texas that have very similar characteristics to the Rocky Mountains that you'd see in Colorado and New Mexico. So we have a lot of biomes here. And even when you look at the lower 48, we have almost all the major biomes that you would see in the lower 48, except for this mixed forest up in the far northeast and some of the chaparral and the rainforest that you would see along the west coast. So we have quite the diversity here. So if you want to get out and see what North America or what the lower 48 really has to offer as far as a natural diversity standpoint, you can find the vast majority of it here in Texas. So to wrap all this up, what is Texas? Well, like I said, Texas is its own other country, as we like to brag sometimes, if you ever heard that slang, especially when it comes to biomes, because we have such a diversity here, along with ecoregions also. So, like I said, you can find most of the major biomes in North America, except for that chaparral and the coastal forest, which you find in the Pacific Northwest and California. Obviously, we don't have the tropical like we see down in the in the Central America, and then the Arctic and the boreal that you see up in the north. Um, then, but we have deciduous forest, grasslands, desert, and montane forest. So, montane forest might be a new term for y'all today. That's going to be that high mountain forest that you see up like in Colorado and New Mexico. And we get part of that in, like I said, in some of the high mountain ranges out in West Texas, the Davis Mountains, the Guadalupe Mountains, the Chias Mountains, and the Big Bend, where you actually get this ponderosa pine forest. So we call that montane forest. So let me move along. So general trends, we're going to start our road trip across Texas and get to the part where we have a lot more pictures and hopefully a little bit more entertaining for y'all. But as we go east to west across Texas, because that's kind of how our road trip's going to go, you're going to see we're going to go from the wettest areas where we have pine forest, which y'all should be familiar with where y'all are located at. Then we drop the pine trees out in a lot of the hardwoods, and we just end up with our toughest hardwoods or toughest oak trees. That's going to be our deciduous forest. Then we go to tall, mid, and short grass prairie. So what that means basically is in that big middle third, really middle half of Texas, as you go further west, you get less rainfall, so your grass growth gets more limited. So in the eastern part of Texas, in that grassland area, you have tall grasses, which if they weren't grazed or haven't been converted over to some kind of non-native improved pasture or cropland. Historically, those grasses would have reached between 4 to 5 to maybe even 6 feet tall in a year. Mid grasses are going to be 12 to 24 inches tall, and short grasses are going to be little to where they might only grow 4 to 8 inches in a year. Uh, and then north to south, you'll see also get up in the far panhandle. We have plants and animals more adapted to sub-freezing temperatures compared to tropical flora and fauna down in the valley. So there's different ecological maps you can use for Texas. I believe this is the one that's in y'all's textbook. So I'm going to go with this. I used to do this presentation from a Piney Woods chapter, and I used a different source that had a lot more ecoregions in Texas. It actually had so it had 14 ecoregions, and I'll show that here at the end. It's another map, but for today we're going to look at Gold's ecoregions, which I believe have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 ecoregions compared to the other source that I used to use from the EPA that had 12 or 13 ecoregions. But Gold's is a good representation, and you can see we have quite a bit diversity, as you already touched, and this is kind of the standard that Parks and Wildlife uses and a lot of government agencies to manage the natural resources in the state of Texas. So with that, we will hop in and start our road trip across Texas. So as we go through each ecoregion, I'm going to highlight on a couple of the characteristics, so kind of what the land looks like and kind of how we use it for our own purposes for humans now. And the reason why that's important is y'all probably know most of our landscapes in Texas are highly altered than what they were 150, 200 years ago prior to European colonization. Uh, and that's just the way it is, and most of it's pretty altered. You can find still some relic sites, but it gets harder and harder, especially the further east in Texas you go, the eastern half of Texas. Pretty much everything east of I-35 and north of like Corpus Christi and San Antonio is going to be pretty altered just because of our high rainfall, and we're able to grow a lot of stuff that we could grow in the old world in Europe. But then we're going to look at pictures of landscape and geography and some of the flora and plants and animals that make that ecoregion unique, and we're going to show some unique examples. So first of all, we're going to start off in the Far East, like we said, and this ecoregion here is going to be green, and it's appropriately labeled as this is going to be the Piney Woods of Texas, as y'all are probably pretty familiar with. Uh, Takes up only about 10% of the state, but when you consider the size of Texas, having a pine forest that takes up 10% of Texas, it's a pretty significant area. And because of that, the Piney Woods is pretty economically important from its historical timber industry. For y'all that don't know, the timber industry is pretty much, I don't want to say it's down the toilet, but it's circling the toilet. Uh, you might think that with all the houses getting built and construction that we would have a very large demand for lumber, which we kind of do, but the problem is we have done such a good job of replanting the piney woods, not only in East Texas, but really across the South and this country as a whole, wherever we grow commercial timber, that we have more timber that's ready to be harvested than we know what to do with. So timber prices really aren't that good. So the timber industry in the piney woods ain't like it used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago. Historically, people in this part of the state, they would buy a timber property, maybe 3, 4, 500,000 acres when they were in their 20s, 30s, and that would be their retirement plan. When they retired at 60, they'd be able to timber off of it and have a pretty nice retirement plan, not only for themselves, but also for their kids. But that's not the case. Woods, and let me go back. It starts up here in the Northeast, and I know some of y'all probably haven't driven around Texas as much as I have, so I try to like to explain where we're at. Uh, for extension agents, we do a lot of traveling across the state, and so out of the 254 odd counties in Texas, I've been to over, I think, 200 of them, so I kind of forget. A lot of people don't know where all these little counties are in the state, so and where stuff is at. So I try to explain that to y'all today. But the piney wood starts up in the northeast, right here where my red dot is at. So that's going to be Texarkana, up there where Texas and Arkansas come together. And then it's going to kind of go to the southwest to over here to Smith County. So that's going to be Tyler, Texas, right there, which is the rose capital of Texas, if any of y'all ever been up there. And then it's going to go west to the Trinity River. So this line down here between Cherokee, Anderson, and Houston County, that's the Trinity River. That kind of marks the boundary of the Piney Woods there in the mid part of the Piney Woods. And then it's going to go west over here to pretty much the western boundary of Walker and Montgomery County, which are pretty much all in the Piney Woods. There is some slivers of different ecoregions in the western edges of Montgomery and Walker County, and if we have time, we may kind of zoom in on that at the tail end of the presentation. But then the Piney Woods are pretty much that north of I-10 as you go from Houston to Beaumont. So in the middle here, you got Nacogdoches, Lufkin, Jasper, but that's your Piney Woods. But the Piney Woods is basically an extension of the southern pine belt. Uh, if you've ever been to Georgia, Mississippi, even parts of Virginia along the coast, and even really southern parts of Maryland and New Jersey, there is not much difference between that and East Texas and the Piney Woods. They don't call it the Piney Woods over there. They just kind of call it the Pine Belt along the East Coast. But it might be a little colder. The tree canopy might look a little bit different, but it has a lot of the same species. So we're basically, the Piney Woods of Texas is just that far western edge of that pine belt that extends all the way to the East Coast and up the Atlantic coast of the United States. Pretty level, has some hills and spots, especially in the northeast around Tyler. There is some pretty, I don't want to say significant topography, but there's some hills that'll take your breath out if you got to hike up it. The one thing that's unique about the Piney Woods compared to most other ecoregions in Texas is the Piney Woods has sandy and acidic soil. So this is important for y'all to know, especially if y'all are wanting to grow stuff in East Texas. Um, Most other parts of the state have limestone, at least part of the soil profile somewhere. So the soils tend to be alkaline, especially west of I-35, compared to the Piney Woods, which has a lot of sand and a lot of acidic soil. So for most of our stuff we want to grow, we tend to want to have more neutral soils and have more clay in it, and you don't really get that in the Piney Woods. But if you want to grow blueberries, blueberries love sandy acidic soils. That's why we have most of our blueberry orchards in the state in the Piney Woods. But most of the region is forest land. Unfortunately, the piney woods today do not look like the piney woods did in the 1800s. Uh, Basically, what happened is, and it started during the Civil War, was there was a huge demand for lumber to build railroads and to support the Confederacy, basically. So the piney woods of Texas started to get timbered out pretty heavily, and that continued through the this latter half of the 1800s. And pretty much at one point, the piney woods was all cropland, and then cotton and that all started waning out, and then it slowly started converting back to forest land in the 1900s, and the A&M Forest Service and the state agencies did a big effort to reforest the piney woods in like the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. So historically, we would have had a pine savanna in the upper reaches out of the floodplains, and we would have had a hardwood forest in the bottomlands along the river. And when I mean pine savanna, I got some pictures here in a minute, but you can go Google like historical pine savanna photos of Texas, and you could see through the pine forest 100, 200, 300 yards easily. How many of y'all driving around the loop around Conroe or around the Woodlands or up I-45 to Huntsville? How far can you see into the forest? Probably about 10 to 20 yards if you're lucky. So our forests in East Texas are drastically different than they were originally. Now it's more loblolly and short-leaf pine plantations if they're managed for timber. Or like most places, like I said, the timber industry ain't what it used to be, so people aren't managing the undergrowth. What I mean by that is the opon basically and the sweet gum, and so it takes over your understory. So The picture on the left is going to be from the Angelina National Forest south of Lufkin. And that's not a great example of a pine savanna, but that is a good representation of what some of our pine savannas look like in Texas now. As you can see, I know they burn this area kind of routinely. It's in the national forest, so for y'all, if y'all might be familiar, they do some burning in Sam Houston National Forest too, north of Conroe. Uh, but you can see it's more open compared to a lot of what you see in the piney woods, which is Yopon, and you can't even see 10 feet into the woods. Uh, the picture on the right, and it's kind of grainy, is Cotto Lake. So the Piney Woods is home to the only natural lake in Texas, and that's going to be Cotto Lake, and it's up in the far northeast. And now, why I put natural lake in parentheses is Cotto Lake was formed by a log jam on the Red River in the 1800s, like before early 1800s. It was probably here in the 1700s, and it was this huge log jam over by Shreveport that backed up into Texas. And some of the historical accounts said this log jam was like 40, 50, 60 miles wide, and it backed the Red River up hundreds and hundreds of miles. Well, in the 1800s, when we wanted to start sending paddle boats up and down the Red River in Louisiana, they blew up the log jam, and then that drained Cotto Lake that was in Texas. So the Army Corps of Engineers came in there and built about a 3 or 5 foot low water dam to keep the lake from draining out, since they blew up the natural dam. So Cotto Lake was historically natural, but now it's maintained by a man-made structure, so it's not really natural anymore. Uh, and plus, we like to say we have a lot of lakes in Texas, and we say Cotto Lake's the only natural lake, but there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, of oxbow ponds and oxbow lakes along rivers and stuff. So we have natural lakes in Texas. They're just not very big. Uh, so I look at some unique plants and animals. Uh, the one on the left, and some of these y'all are probably pretty familiar with, is the red cockaded woodpecker. I believe there's some colonies of these guys in the Jones Forest there in Conroe. So you can actually go see these pretty quick if y'all want to. They're kind of a conservation success story. So the red cockaded woodpecker, uh, it nests in old tree cavities. So most woodpeckers kind of like make their own cavities to nest in. Uh, the red cockaded woodpeckers actually nest in natural cavities, so they need old growth trees that were maintained by by fire, basically. So like 100-year-old pine trees. So when we logged out all the pine trees, we took away all their natural nesting habitat. So their population basically collapsed. But they're kind of a conservation success story because they were put on the endangered species list, and we pretty much have brought them back from the brink across the South, not only in Texas. And we have a bunch of colonies throughout the South, and their population is expanding. The only bad part, most of their colonies are on conservation properties like nature conservancy properties or national forest or national wildlife refuges. There's not a whole bunch of colonies on private land. So in Texas, where we don't have a bunch of bunch of public land, we only have a handful of colonies because they're on in the national forest. But their population has recovered so much. A few years ago, they downgraded them from endangered to threatened. So we're going the right way with there. In the piney woods, we probably have our highest diversity of reptiles and amphibians. So we have box turtles. So I mean, this is a three-toed box turtle, not unique to the piney woods. It can be found kind of throughout the eastern half of Texas, but just wanted to put that in there for reptiles and amphibians. The middle picture here is hard to see, and I know plants are terribly hard to recognize and ID, especially on a picture. But for y'all that don't know, the reason why I put this in here, Texas is home to three native species of pine trees. Or the piney woods is home to three species of pine trees. We have other pine trees out in West Texas, but that's another case. But for the piney woods, you have longleaf pine, loblolly pine, and shortleaf pine. So it's kind of hard to tell, but this is a longleaf pine here in the middle with the very long needles. This is a shortleaf pine kind of here in the background, and you can see how much smaller the needles are. And then the most common pine is loblolly, which it's hard to tell, but I took this picture. There's a loblolly coming up kind of right here with these kind of mid-sized needles here at the bottom. So kind of unique to see all three of these pine trees growing next to each other because they might all look like pine trees, but our loblollies, our short leaves, and the long leaves all have kind of niche soils and environments they live in. So you typically don't see all three growing together. Loblollies tend to be more in bottomlands. Short needle pine, short leaf pines tend to be more in uplands and drier soils, and long leaves tend to be in those areas that are maintained by fire. Um, Top right is a paddlefish. So a paddlefish is only going to be found in the far northeast parts of the piney woods. It's native to the Mississippi River drainage. But the paddlefish is unique. I bet that's probably a fish most of y'all have never seen before. But some of y'all maybe have eaten. So before we get to that, you see its big mouth up here. It's kind of like a sturgeon, if any of y'all are familiar with sturgeons. They got this big mouth that they basically open up, and they got big filters in their gills, and they basically eat like little plankton and stuff like a whale. They're pretty much feeding the same matter that a big whale does out in the ocean. But like I said, you can find them up in the northeast part of Texas, like in Cotto Lake is kind of their stronghold in Texas. They're a protected species in Texas, but in other states you can actually fish for them. In some states, like I think Illinois and those like along the Mississippi River where their population is a lot higher, you can actually commercially fish for them. So if you ever have had caviar and it says it's from the United States, it was likely from this guy right here. So these guys are harvested for caviar up in like Illinois, Missouri, and some of those states. Um, so that's just kind of a little side note. So that's a paddlefish. We believe the big nose or the rostrum on it has like little electric sensors in it that help it sense like the little microscopic plankton in the water to help it feed. But I think fish biologists aren't 100% sure on that. Uh, Bottom right picture is going to be a Louisiana pine snake. It's kind of like a subspecies of a bull snake. So if y'all, any herp guys or folks on here, y'all probably know of a bull snake. It's a pretty common snake, but this is a kind of a subspecies called a Louisiana pine snake. It is probably the most highly endangered species in Texas that's still in Texas. And what I mean by that is like we probably don't have jaguars anymore in Texas, so there are probably less of them in Texas. But I mean, there's jaguars elsewhere. Uh, but we still have some Louisiana pine snakes, but they basically burrow in these really sandy soils you find in deep East Texas and into Louisiana. And they live in underground all the time in gopher tunnels, and they eat gophers and moles. Uh, but their habitat is associated with that historical longleaf pine savanna that was maintained by fire. And I think it's been about 15, 20 years or so. The last time they did kind of a comprehensive survey in Texas and Louisiana, and they only found like 4 or 5 colonies of Louisiana pine snake in Texas, and they were pretty much all right on that Sabine, Newton County, Louisiana line. And most of those colonies only had like 4 to 10 individuals in them. So there's probably a handful hanging on over there by Sabine Lake, but most of the Louisiana pine snakes are now just in Louisiana. So that's one of the most highly, it probably is one of the most endangered reptiles, not only in Texas, but also in the United States. Uh, so I spent way too much time on the piney woods, but we'll move on. That was probably important since y'all live in the piney woods, or most of y'all probably do. Next, we're going to move over to kind of this maroon color. And I don't know if the authors of this map did this intentionally, but this maroon color is the Post Oak Savannah, and right in the middle of it is College Station. So I don't know if they colored it maroon because A&M is in the Post Oak Savannah or not, but I like to think that they did, just because it would be appropriate. But it is kind of an off maroon. But either way, so this kind of maroon color here west of the Piney Woods is going to be our Post Oak Savannah. And the Post Oak Savannah is basically has a lot of similar characteristics and kind of natural functions is the piney woods as far as prescribed fire, maintaining open forest, a lot of the same plants and animals. But it's the plants and animals we find in the piney woods that are just more adapted to rainfall, basically less than like 50 inches. It's our most drought hardiest trees in Texas. And the piney wood or the post oak savanna in this maroon is kind of our last kind of forest ecoregion in Texas. Once we get west of this, it's more of a shrub or a transition type ecoregion or a grassland. So our post oak savanna starts up here along the Red River. Dallas is over here, so it's going to be between Dallas and Texarkana. And it kind of goes in this little sliver down here west of Tyler. Tyler's here in Smith County. This is going to be I-45 right here. So if y'all have ever driven up I-45 north of Huntsville, Huntsville's here. So once you get into Madisonville, Leon County, Freestone County, so like Centerville area, that's all going to be in the Post Oak Savanna. If you're going up to I-45, once you get to Corsicana up here, you're no longer in the Post Oak Savanna. But that Post Oak Savanna comes down here through College Station and then goes just east of Travis and Austin County, San Marcos, New Braunfels over here in Comal and Hayes, and kind of loops down south of Bexar County, south of San Antonio, and then goes east over to the coastal plains, kind of then just west of Houston. As you can see, there's kind of this black sliver here. That's our next ecoregion, which is the Blackland Prairie. So there's a northern and a southern Blackland Prairie. So the northern Blackland Prairie is west of the Post Oaks. The southern Blackland Prairie kind of splits the Post Oak in half down here. So you kind of got a sliver here south of it. But we'll jump into the Blackland Prairie next. But you can see the Post Oak Savanna does touch just a far northwest corner of Walker County. And then kind of down here where Harris, Montgomery, and Waller County kind of transition. This map likes to call that the Post Oak Savanna. I would kind of disagree with that. If any, this would be kind of like around Tomball area, Magnolia. I personally say that's more of the piney woods than the Post Oak. I think you got to kind of get kind of further west to around Prairie View and Waller and where I'm sitting today in Hempstead to really get in the Post Oak Savanna. But that's kind of splitting hairs. I mean, that's kind of typical when we draw these maps and look at different sources. There's some variability in there because, you know, us as humans like to put nature and define lines and define stuff, but nature doesn't define stuff in the natural world. It's a constant battle between these different processes. And so in most cases, you're not going to see a defining line between two ecoregions. And the piney woods and the post oak savanna is a great example of that because you can find pine trees in Grimes County in pockets that are like the piney woods that you'd see in Huntsville, but it's more post oak at that point. So, you transition. So, post oak savanna, again, we already talked about. It's a western extension of that deciduous woods that we see in the eastern United States, but it's just our most hardiest pine trees. Pretty level. Sandy clay loams, underlying clay pan. So that's important to know because I'd ask y'all if y'all are in person, but since we're not, what is sandy and clay loams? Is that a good, with an underlying clay pan? Is that a good soil or not? Well, if y'all were gardeners, y'all would know that that's not because you got sandy soil on top that's going to dry out pretty quickly after it rains, but then you got a clay pan underneath that tends to hold water. So you have like the two opposite spectrums. So you typically don't want really, really sandy soil when you're growing crops, and you don't want a clay pan also. So because of that, the post oak savanna was never heavily farmed like the ecoregions surrounding it. So most of it has stayed in rangeland, but a lot of that rangeland has been converted over to improved pasture, so like Bermuda or Bahia grass, so old world grasses. Historically, it would have been a post oak and blackjack oak savanna with a little blue stem, which is our state grass understory, and then we would have had hardwoods in the bottomlands. But just like with the piney woods, we have a lot of loss of this open forest, canopy open forest savanna because of overgrazing, encroachment by yaupon and other story plants because of lack of fire and brush management. So this is a great example. Again, I'm sorry the picture is kind of a little grainy, but the picture on the left is going to be typical post oak savanna that you'd see around Madisonville, College Station area. You have these post oak trees in the background, which we have a lot of old post oak trees still in the post oak savanna. I mean, it don't take much to drive around the post oak savanna and see post oak trees. You can say, yeah, those trees were here before we ever got here. I mean, it's not unheard of to see 2, 3, 4, 500-year-old post oak trees. But we let this yoke pond just take over the understory. So the picture on the right is what the post oak savanna should have looked like historically. So this is Gus Engling WMA up in Anderson, and up in Anderson County, and it's a Parks and wildlife management area. If you're ever up there, I highly recommend you go do it. I used to take my Piney Woods chapter. We went up there on a field trip one time for their class because it's just a great example of how the eastern half of Texas used to look. And so what they did was Parks and Wildlife has had this property. It's about 10,000 acres or so. They've had this property since like the 50s or 60s. They've had it for a while. But either way, before they had this property, it used to be so full of quail that they used to hold national bird dog trials out there. So what I mean by that is quail hunters and these bird dog trainers in the early 1900s would come out to this property in Anderson County, and they would compete to see who could scout up the most quail. When Parks and Wildlife took it over, it looked more like this picture on the left, just full choked out a yoke pond. And so over the last, 40, 50 years, Parks and Wildlife has done a great job restoring this property to what the post oak savanna looked like prior to European colonization. And as you can see, we would have had bison in here because there was enough grass, probably not in a large scale, but they'd come down here and graze occasionally. You had quail and turkey, and they've actually restocked quail and turkey on this property. And they're also restocking a Texas horned toads out here.
Matthew, can you please repeat the name of that area that you recommend?
Gus, uh, Gus Engling Wildlife Management Area.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. And so yeah, so if y'all ever get up there, I highly recommend it. Most wildlife management areas at Parks and Wildlife Home, they're managed for hunters basically because they're brought through hunter license fees. So they're managed as a hunting resource. But they use certain ones as like their showcase properties to show landowners how to manage their properties to match like historical characteristics. So either way, the Gus Engling Wildlife Management Area is Texas Parks and Wildlife showcase property to show landowners what the post oak savanna should look like if it's managed properly. So they actually have a public driving tour up there. So it's about a 10-mile tour, I believe, where you can go in there any day. You might have to pay like $2 or something, but it's not much. And it's just self-pay. And they have a self-guided driving tour where they have different stations that explain what they did and how they did it. And you can go through there. It's a really neat property. Uh, and if you know where to look, you'd have to get with the biologist because they don't point it out. They have carnivorous bogs in there too, so they got carnivorous plants like pitcher plants and stuff, but they don't show where those are publicly because they don't want people stumping them all up. But uh, so some other plants in the post oak savanna. We don't have a whole lot of unique animals. The only one that's kind of unique from a is protected standpoint is going to be the Houston toad, which is here on the left. You see those around Bastrop, Austin County, Brazos County, so kind of west of y'all. They live in some of these old post oak savanna bogs that were maintained again through prescribed fire, kind of this open bogs. So, Houston toad, it's a protected species. We have Navasota ladies tresses. This is an endangered orchid. It's on the endangered species list. Um, you find that again kind of around a lot of places you find the Houston toad. They're kind of similar, maintained in these old post oak savanna habitats. Um, if y'all have ever driven down Highway 30 between Huntsville and College Station, there's a big dump there on the left right before you get to Brazos County. When they built that dump, they actually brought that property and they did their environmental assessment and found a bunch of Navasota lady tresses out there. So part of that dump is actually set aside and preserved for the Navasota ladies tresses orchid because it's found out there. Uh, and what I mean, part of the dump is reserved. They're not using part of the property they brought as a dump, obviously, or a landfill, I guess would be a more appropriate term. Uh, Picture on the right is the piney or is the lost pines around Bastrop. So some of y'all maybe have driven around Bastrop and noticed there's pine trees out there. So we call that the lost pines. Uh, we'll go back here. Depending on so the lost pines are going to be like they're around Bastrop. There's some of them in Fayette County. Depending on your source, some sources will group that as part of the Piney Woods ecoregion, just like a disjunct island of it. But a lot of sources will group it as part of the post oak savanna. It really doesn't matter what the people tell us that study historical geological centuries, that during the last ice age, the piney woods basically extended all the way out here to the Bastrop area. And then as we've got warmer and drier, it's shrunk, but there's still a few islands of it left out there. Uh, so that's the piney woods. So next we're going to move into the blackland prairie. So that's appropriately colored, this black color here. Like we already said, there's a northern blackland prairie, and then there's a southern blackland prairie. So we'll start off with the southern one because that one might be a little bit more y'all are familiar with. Sometimes you'll also hear this called the Fayette Prairie or the Washington County Prairie or the kind of up there around Anderson. Richards call it the Anderson Prairie. But it's the southern blackland prairie, and it's this little sliver that starts kind of in the middle of Grimes County around Anderson and Richards area, and it goes through Brenham, LaGrange, and down here to Cuero, basically in DeWitt County. If you ever go to Shiner and to go to the brewery there and get you a Shiner Brock off the line, so Shiner's right there. Shiner's right in the middle of the little sliver of the southern Blackland Prairie. And you can see that if you ever drive west on I-10 or 90 going towards Shiner or even around Brenham, if you're coming down 290, like around Hempstead, we got a lot of pine trees, and then all of a sudden you kind of hit this more open area. I mean, there's still oak trees out there, but you can see the hills a lot better. That's going to be your southern Blackland Prairie. Your northern Blackland Prairie starts up here along the Red River. It really doesn't extend into Oklahoma. So it kind of starts right here at the Oklahoma line, goes through Dallas, and pretty much follows that I-35 corridor. So we got Waco here in McClellan County. You got Temple here in Bell County, Round Rock and Williamson, Alliston and Travis, San Marcos and Hayes, New Braunfels and Comal, and then San Antonio down here in the south. So all the Blackland Prairie, all these major cities along I-35 pretty much either are in or border or sit right on the Blackland Prairie boundary. So if I was in person today, I'd ask y'all to raise your hands and try to guess, why do y'all think so many of our major cities are in the Blackland Prairie? And if you think about it, what were we doing in the 1800s? Texas was an agricultural economy. That was the main thing. And back then we didn't have roads and railroads like we did now. So we shipped a lot of our cotton down rivers to the coast to get shipped overseas. So all these towns kind of popped up along this Blackland Prairie because this Blackland Prairie was great for farming. And since we grew cotton, we shipped cotton down the Trinity, the Colorado, the Guadalupe River. We shipped them down river to the coast. So that's these towns popped up in a lot of these major towns that we have in Texas got their roots back from when they were little farming communities in the 1800s. But just think of that. If you're ever traveling down I-35 between Dallas and San Antonio, you're going right down the Blackland Prairie. Pretty simple. I do want to point out, because a lot of people, if you've been up to Dallas, Fort Worth, the DFW area, it's just one major metroplex and city, and a lot of people don't realize that Tarrant County over here in Fort Worth is actually in a different ecoregion that we call the Cross Timbers. So even though it might look like one big major urban area up there, your soil types and what you can garden and what you can grow in your if you want to do like native landscaping. So if y'all got friends that live up in the DFW, you can grow different plants in Dallas than you can in Fort Worth, just because it's in a different soil type and a different ecoregion. But like I said, the Blackland Prairie has very deep, deep soils, these very deep clay black soils that was historically the true tall grass prairie in Texas. This is when you ever read old historical settlers accounts and they said they were going across the prairie of Texas and the grass was up to the stirrups or the belly of the horse. This was them going through the tall grass prairie of Texas. Farming was dominant. It still is dominant in a lot of the region, but urbanization is a big deal. It has the big four. So what I mean by the big four in Texas, are really not in Texas, but in North America, our big four native tall grass species are big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. So that's big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. So if you're in a remnant version Blackland Prairie site in Texas, up around Dallas, and you go look at one maybe up in Ohio, you're not in the Blackland Prairie, but you still might be in a tall grass prairie. It has those same four species of grasses. Those are the big four. Limited woody vegetation. Fire would have kept most of it out. There's I don't want to say it's an argument, but a discussion amongst archaeologists and even biologists was how much fire was historically on the landscape, not only in Texas, but really in North America as a whole, because we know a lot of these ecoregions like the Blackland Prairie and even the piney woods to that standpoint evolved over time with fire being part of the natural regime every 3 to 5 years. And we used to think they were naturally started, and they probably were started by lightning a lot. But the more and more we learn about historical civilizations in this country, so Native Americans basically, they realized that the big game followed these fires because they ate on all the grass that came up. So we think a lot of the fires that these ecoregions evolved with over the centuries was also set man-made. So we like to think that kind of this concept that we started when America started and we came over from Europe, that was when mankind started altering the ecoregions and the landscape in North America. Well, the Native Americans were doing it for centuries before we ever got here, tens of thousands of centuries, so or hundreds of years. So, just something to keep in mind. But in the Blackland Prairie, most species have been expedited. So what I mean by that is they're not extinct. They're still pretty. Most of the species you would have found in the Blackland Prairie are still pretty common somewhere else, either in Texas or somewhere else in North America. But they're no longer found in the Blackland Prairie in Texas. So here's a great example of the Blackland Prairie. You got these deep clay soils on the left. For y'all garden folks that are listening today, I'm sure you can look at that and say, yeah, that's rich in organic material and make great garden soil. Well, make great farming, and that's why we turned 99% of this into farmland, and now it's getting turned into Dallas and Austin and all the big cities. The picture on the right is going to be a remnant Blackland Prairie that's owned by the Nature Conservancy, I believe, up somewhere around Dallas. I've actually never been there. I just pulled the picture offline. But as you can see, it's it's a grassland ecosystem, about what you would think of a tall grass prairie when you picture it. Got a few trees here in the background, but no trees. I will say one thing that you see in these little remnant prairie sites, not only in the Blackland Prairie but in other ecoregions in Texas, is what we call this microtopography. So when these sites have never been plowed over, you might look across that and say, yeah, that looks pretty level and smooth, which it pretty much is, but there's little dips and little ups in there. And what I mean by that is this right here might be 6 inches lower than this over here. And we call those little hills pimple mounds. And basically that creates this little microtopography that creates different diversity of plants. So you might have on these little pimple mounds, it might be 6 inches, a foot taller than over here. you might have a different assortment of wildflowers and grasses than you do over here that are maybe a little bit more adapted to growing in wetter soil. So here's a picture of our big four. Little blue stem on the top left, state grass of Texas. Big blue stem that's known for its turkey foot seed head. Indian grass here in the middle. And then switchgrass on the right, which just looks kind of similar to Johnson grass, if any of y'all know what Johnson grass is. All right. So I don't have a great picture to show you of plants and animals in the Blackland Prairie because they're not there anymore. So here's an artist's conception of what the Blackland Prairie looked like prior to us coming here. As you can see, we had bison. I always got to double check myself because people will call them buffalo, and I do that a whole lot too. Technically, from a biological standpoint, we have bison in North America, we have buffalo in Africa, in this Asian continent. I always get it wrong, but I just think of water. You think of water buffalo in like India. So if you think that's how I keep it straight in my head. If I think of water buffalo, I think of like India. So then I know we have bison in North America. But we had bison. You can see we got our wildfire in the back that's keeping it a grassland. You know, you still might find our monarchs and some of our pollinators and some quail in some pockets, but you're not going to find this wolf. You're no longer going to find prairie chickens. A lot of our grassland birds are going down in numbers in the Blackland Prairie. So yeah, but you can see a pretty diverse ecosystem. And I put this picture up here because I asked y'all, because I'm sure some of y'all have driven I-35 between Austin and Dallas before, been down I-35 at some point. How many people have ever seen this driving anywhere down I-35 in Central Texas? No, we have so much altered the Blackland Prairie. It's not even a shadow of what it used to be. It's been totally altered. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so as we move west of the Blackland Prairie, we get into this yellow color ecoregion, and I've mentioned it already. That's going to be our cross timbers and prairies. It's it's a transitional ecoregion. And so I mentioned that the post oak savanna that we talked about already was our last forested ecoregion. The cross timbers is kind of a forested ecoregion, but it has areas of prairies in it. And so when you think of the name, it's called the cross timbers, and it's appropriately named because basically what happened when these settlers came across here in the 1800s as they were going west, they would hit a band of oak trees and junipers, and it would be post oaks and blackjack oaks and some live oaks that was really thick. So they'd call that the timbers. And then they'd hit this other band of like a 20-mile stretch that was open prairie. So that was the cross prairie. So they called it the cross timbers because it was timbers crossed by prairie. So our cross timbers region is very much a transitional region between our woods to the east and our prairies in the Great Plains to the west. So we start up here in the Red River. That whole middle third of Oklahoma, like Oklahoma City, even on up into Kansas some, that's all going to be your cross timbers, and then it comes down into Texas along the Red River. So it's between Fort Worth on the east end, and then if you ever gone up 287 to Amarillo, Wichita Falls is up here. So Wichita Falls is not in the cross timbers, but it's that area between Wichita Falls and Fort Worth, basically. It goes south all the way down to kind of north of Austin, according to Gold's map. So Travis County's here where Austin's is at. So that I-35 basically splits the difference between the cross timbers and the Blackland Prairie. Oh, my screen went dark. Give me a second. It does that sometimes. I'm not sure why. But I-35 kind of splits it. You got Smithville here in Erath County. If you ever been to Dinosaur Valley State Park, pretty popular destination. It's right there in Somerville. But Callahan, I believe, is Abilene, so that's going to be west of here. So it's kind of this middle area of the state. Big transitional zone. When you get down here to the south, when I will talk about the hill country and the Edwards Plateau later, but most of y'all are probably familiar with the hill country around like Kerrville and that area, that transitions into the cross timbers. This part of the state, to me, uh, I like to really, me just personally, I like to define stuff and like say, all right, this is this is that. So when I'm traveling through this part of the state, and I can't tell if it's the hill country, the cross timbers, or our next ecoregion, which is the interior plains. It just drives me nuts because I just like to classify it into something, and I can't. So that again, the cross timbers is just a big transitional zone. So because of that, you get a variety of soil types and geography, but most of the soils are pretty shallow and rocky, or have a rocky component to it. So ranching has been dominant, not a lot of farming in this ecoregion, along with this is also the ecoregion. So east of I-35, generally rainfall isn't a limiting factor so much. We get into this part of the state. This is where we start getting to areas where we're going to have multi-year long droughts, even though most parts of Texas have been in a multi-year long drought recently. Uh, but rainfall starts to become a limiting factor. So you had the cross timbers, then you had open prairies, you had your oak forest, then you also had some juniper woodlands. So the picture on the left is a great example of a pretty good example of cross timbers on the prairie side. So you can see all this in the foreground in the ditch and even growing back up here in the background. That kind of bluish tint grass, or maybe even purple tintish, that's all little blue stem. So this is a pretty good little native grassland right here. This is what the prairie would have historically looked like in the cross timbers, and the cross timbers would have been one of those mid-grass prairies that grow between 18 to 24 inches tall. And then you see we have our post oaks here in the background. Uh, I will say these little shrubby green things here, this lighter green, those are mesquite. Mesquite was historically probably found throughout Texas, but to the extent that it is now, it was not. And again, that has to do with us not letting fire control brush. Oak trees are pretty adapted to fire. Mesquite is not, especially when they're young. They'll burn the tops off and you can kill them. And then overgrazing. So mesquite and brush encroachment is probably something that affects every ecoregion in Texas, and it's probably one of, besides habitat fragmentation and urbanization, brush encroachment is probably one of the biggest environmental issues in the state of Texas. And it's really not only in Texas, it's now, we got mesquite and cedar being an issue as far north as the South Dakota and Nebraska now, which they've never had mesquite and cedar up there. So, and there's some other things that are going into that too, changing climate, different concentration of oxygen in the air. So, but that's a talk for another day. Picture on the right is going to be an example of more of that thick woodland, so the timber part of the cross timbers. And this is going to be kind of near Possum Kingdom if you've ever been up to that part of the state. But you can see we do have some limestone type hills here sometimes, so it can be kind of some rougher topography in the cross timbers. So when we look at animals and plants, it says the cross timbers is a transitional zone. You really don't find any animals and plants you can't find anywhere else in the state. But I will say the cross timbers is unique, and I forgot to mention it earlier, was since rainfall is limiting, the soils was pretty shallow. There's no major urban areas in the state other than Fort Worth on the far eastern end. Uh, and weren't able to log it out because the oak trees were too short and they were too gnarly because they were just slow growing and they got twisted and all that. So it's unmarketable timber. The cross timbers may be one of the most intact ecoregions left in the state of Texas, as far as looking what it looked like prior to the 1800s and having a lot of the natural flora and fauna that used to be there. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of it that's been altered too, but as far as comparing to other ecoregions, I kind of lean to thinking the cross timbers might be one of our most intact ecoregions left. Uh, but so with that being said, since it's a transitional zone and there's not much anything unique to it, I just put animals that when we think of Texas, you can find in the cross timbers, but you can, so, I mean, We have a lot of turkeys in the cross timbers, but we have a lot of turkeys in a lot of parts of Texas. White-tailed deer hunting's a big industry in the cross timbers, big deer populations up there, and of course, can't think of Texas without thinking of that jackrabbit running across the prairie. So uh, that's the cross timbers. Next, we're going to move into this salmon-colored ecoregion, which is going to be here. And that's going to be our rolling plains. You'll also sometimes call it the interior low plains or the Great Plains. So when you have this picture of the people on the Oregon Trail going across the vast prairie, and we think of that as the Great Plains. Like I said, sometimes we call that the interior low plains from a biological standpoint. That's going to be this salmon color in Texas. So this is that big part of the Great Plains that extends up into Kansas and Oklahoma and parts of Nebraska. This would also been that part. We think of when they were going on the Oregon and the California Trail. This rolling plains, this interior low plains, the settlers just kind of skipped because it was really too dry to farm. They wanted to go out west, so this was kind of one of the last strongholds of areas in the country in the lower 48 that when America was settled in the west that we started to settle. So the salmon color here, it'll come back in a minute, I hope. There we go. So the salmon color here is our rolling plains. So it's west of the cross timbers. It includes Wichita Falls, Abilene down here in Taylor and Callahan County. And then it goes west to about this eastern half of the panhandle. So this brown color is the high plains, which is going to be our next ecoregion. But between the rolling plains and the high plains is what we call this Caprock Escarpment, which I'm showing right now with my laser pointer. It's this really rugged line. And so if you heard me earlier mention, most ecoregions kind of transition from one ecoregion to another. That is not the case with the rolling plains to the high plains in Texas. We have this Caprock Escarpment, which is literally about 1,000 to 2,000 foot drop that just drops off the face of the earth and almost feels like when you're traveling up here. So you have a very, very defining line between the high plains and the rolling plains in Texas. So right through here is what we call the Caprock Escarpment, and we'll show some pictures of that here in a minute. And then up here is the Canadian River that flows through here, and we call this the Canadian Escarpment up here. And it extends into this part of Oklahoma, and it really goes all the way to New Mexico until you hit the Rocky Mountains, like around Albuquerque and Santa Fe. But the Canadian escarpments up here in the Panhandle are not quite as rugged as the Caprock escarpments around here. The Canadian escarpments are a little bit more broader. It's a broader floodplain, basically. But the Canadian River is a major river, not only in Texas, but in the lower Great Plains. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So the rolling plains, I already told you, it's the southern extension of that low interior plains that extends up into Kansas, Oklahoma, parts of Nebraska. Kind of level to rolling, a lot of red clays and sand. So if any of y'all ever seen the Brazos River down here, because Brazos River is close to where I'm at, and you see how red and dirty the Brazos River can be. That's because it's getting all this red clay and sand down in the rolling plains, and it's taking it down with it down to the east part of Texas. So that's where the Brazos River red color comes from, the rolling plains up in this part of the state. Farming is a big deal up here, and we can grow some wheat. This is a big wheat production part of the state. Cotton to a lesser extent. Too dry for corn unless it's irrigated. It's a midgrass prairie. Woody vegetation would have only been limited to the biggest watersheds, so parts of the Brazos, Colorado, Red River, Canadian River. Unfortunately, due to the lack of fire and overgrazing, the rolling plains has almost been transformed completely to a mesquite shrubland. Now, it's kind of interesting because we've lost nearly all of our endemic prairie species. So what I mean by that is bison, prairie chickens are no longer in the rolling plains for the most part. But bobwhite quail, not to get too much into it, talk about bobwhite quail, bobwhite quail like a good mixture of grasses interspersed with shrubland. So a lot of this rolling plains has actually become really good bobwhite quail habitat because we've let some shrub grow up in it. Now, on the flip side of that, you can let it could become too much of a shrubland and the shrub starts choking out the grass, too much of it, and it becomes not usable by quail. But there's a sweet spot in there, and because of that, a lot of the rolling plains is really the last epicenter for bobwhite quail in Texas. The rolling plains has the highest populations of quail in Texas. Uh, Picture on the left is going to be south of Wichita Falls. I took a picture of this because that typical of the rolling plains, just looks like a rolling grassland basically. You can see the mesquite and the shrubs coming in the background. But I took this because you might think, well, that looks like a pretty good grassland there. Well, I took the picture so I know this was all improved Bermuda and other non-native grasses. So a lot of the rolling plains that is grassland still are kind of open. It's not native grasses out there. Picture on the right is Wichita Falls State or Lake Arrowhead State Park by Wichita Falls. Again, you can see the grassland in the foreground, but you can see how thick the mesquite's getting in the background. Historically, there would have been hardly any mesquite in this landscape. Picture on the bottom right is the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. So our woodlands would have just been along some of these deep, deep, bigger rivers in this part of the state. Uh, so that was kind of the eastern part of the rolling plains. The western part of the rolling plains, where we get to the Caprock Escarpment and the Canadian Escarpment, so is a little bit different. So if you kind of follow my line here, everything east or to the right of my line is kind of more rolling in what we talked about already. Everything west or to the left of my line is going to be in that Canadian or that Caprock Canyon Escarpment land, and it's going to be more rugged, variety of soils, a lot more ragged. I already talked about that latitudinal divide between the rolling plains and the high plains when you drop off into the escarpment. Because it's so rocky and airy, not much farming. And this would have had historically been more like a juniper, cedar type scrub oak savanna with some grama, short grass, buffalo grass. So now we're getting into that short grasses where that grama buffalo grass is only going to get 6 to 8 inches tall. And we'll show pictures of the Caprock Escarpment and Canadian River. So, this is we'll start on the top left. So this is Palladora Canyon. It's the second largest canyon in the United States. It's about 100 miles long and I think it'd be about 10 to 20 miles wide in spots. The Palladora State Park is a beautiful state park. If you've ever been up there, it's just south of Amarillo. Highly recommended. I actually was up there this summer. Had a meeting in Lubbock, and I checked out Palladora for a couple days while I was up there. But that's what the Caprock Escarpment kind of looks like. You can see very rugged landscape, something that you kind of picture out of the west. Picture on the right is going to be, there's two state parks that you can find in the Caprock Escarpment. Palladora Canyon up by Amarillo, and then Caprock Canyons, which is going to be east of Lubbock, which is going to be this picture on the right. If you ask me which one I like better, I would say Caprock, just because I think it's a little bit more. Palladora is pretty popular, being that it's the second largest canyon and biggest one in Texas. Caprock's a little bit lesser crowds. Palladora kind of gives kind of like a national park vibe to it. Caprock's, I think, is a little bit more rugged. Even though it's not as deep as Palladora, it's a little bit more rugged and a little bit more remote. But that's Caprock Canyons to the right. And the bottom left is Caprock Canyon State Park also. And I wanted to put this picture in here because this picture here on the bottom left that I'm circling, just to drive home the point of how rugged this landscape is along the Caprock Escarpment. You might think you could walk across there. Well, I was out there and I wanted to walk to this ridge back there, and we started taking across, and it's hard to tell by this picture, but every 100 to 200 yards is about a 100-foot draw or creek through there, and a drop off that was just a straight cliff, so you could not even walk across this landscape without hurting yourself or having a rope. So one of the more pretty parts of the state, Caprock Escarpment. So let me look real quick. Okay, so here is going to be the Canadian River here in the bottom picture. And it might not look that impressive, but I want y'all to take a point and focus in on this. The Canadian River is very unique in what it is and kind of what it provides to some wildlife. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But as you can see, the Canadian River is pretty shallow, but it's kind of broad. And this picture is probably not the best picture, but you can see how it's got these sandbars that I'm kind of highlighting, and then they're kind of surrounded by water. So these sandbars are going to be very important for a bird that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But just kind of keep this picture of the Canadian River in your mind. Very broad, very shallow river that has these sandbars in the middle. So when we start looking at plants and animals, we already talked about them some, but you got two here on the left that you can find in the rolling plains. Our black-tailed prairie dogs, very typical of the plains of the North America. But this burrowing owl is about yay big, not very big owl, but it lives in these prairie dog towns. It doesn't eat the prairie dogs, but it actually burrows down into the tunnels they create, and it lives in cavities basically. You got your state reptile here in the middle. You got your state grass on the top right, which is side oats grama, which becomes very common out in this part of the state, in the more arid part of the state. And then we got bobwhite quail. We already talked about them. Black grama here on the bottom left. So side oats and black grama were a big major component of the grass canopy in this part of the state. But here, I always spend way too much time on this slide, but there's a lot to talk on this slide. So picture on the top left, I see Wendy mention Cat Rock Canyon has bison. Yeah, they do, and I'm actually going to get to that here in a minute. That's why I said I got way too much on this slide. But picture on the top left, this is a tern. So when you think of terns, you think kind of the golf or, a shorebird. This is the interior tern. And the interior tern is unique that it actually nests on these rivers that we find in the interior plains of the country. So from Texas on up into the Dakotas and probably southern Canada a little bit. It's a protected species, not because we're overhunting it, but because we're destroying their nesting grounds, basically. So believe it or not, this bird is actually sitting on its nest right now. And I know it just looks like it's sitting on sand, but it's actually sitting on its nest. So what this interior tern does is it goes into these sandbars. Remember how I said the Canadian River? And we'll go back. Remember to picture the Canadian River, big broad river with very shallow with these sandbars in the middle. So the terns go and nest on these sandbars in the middle of these rivers like the Canadian River for protection. Because even though the water might only be 6 inches to a foot deep around them, it's enough to keep the raccoons and the coyotes and stuff away from them because they're not going to hassle with trying to go through the water. But what has happened is not only in the Canadian River, but also in other rivers in the central part of North America up through like Kansas. So like the Platte River would be another example in Nebraska. We have drained these rivers so shallow, both for irrigation purposes, but for also drinking purposes. And we reduced the flow because of creation of dams, again, for either flood control or in most cases for drinking for cities or farming, that we've reduced the flow so much in a lot of these rivers that these terns nest in the central part of the country, that the sandbars are now connected to the bank. So if you can picture that now, as the river has gotten less flow, there's less water, so the sandbars are connected to the bank. And these sandbars that used to be in the middle of the river, well, now the predators can just walk right out to the tern's nest. And as you can imagine, if you're a raccoon or a coyote, it's not too hard to walk up to this bird and get the eggs off the nest. So the tern's population has gone down, and that's why we put them on the protected species list because their nesting habitat's disappearing. The good thing about the Canadian River in Texas is the Canadian River in Texas has some of the best habitat left for the interior tern in North America. So we have good nesting ground left. So the Canadian River is very important for the continuation of this species. So that's just something, most people just see a little shallow river up in the panhandle and don't think anything about the consequences of draining water out of it. So we will get to the bison here in the middle because I think that's kind of a fan favorite. But I want to talk about this guy before we move on to from the Canadian River. This is the Arkansas silvery minnow, and it's native to the Arkansas River drainage all the way from Arkansas on through New Mexico. The Canadian River is part of the Arkansas River drainage. Now, the Arkansas silvery minnow is having difficulties. It's also a protected species because it lays an egg and then the egg gets fertilized and then it has to stay suspended in that water column. I don't remember the exact time, but for 48 hours, 2, 3 days, something like that. That egg has to stay suspended in that water column before the egg hatches and you have a little fingerling. Well, historically, the flow has been great enough in the Arkansas River drainage that the flow of the rivers would keep the egg suspended in the water column and it wouldn't drop out and hit the bottom. When that egg drops out of the water column and hits the substrate on the bottom of the river, it dies. That's it, it's done. It has to stay suspended in the water. So the population has drastically decreased because, again, we not only reduce flows, but we put so many impoundments and reservoirs along the Arkansas River drainage basin that when these little minnows lay their eggs, they end up running into a reservoir, and obviously there's not much flow in a reservoir, so the egg drops out onto the bottom. So long story short, the Arkansas River silvery minnow, I don't even think can be found in the actual main body of the Arkansas River anymore in Oklahoma and Arkansas because there's so many impoundments that it's just reduced the flow so much. But the Canadian River, as I think they say, they need like 75 to 100 miles of free flowing river. Uh, the Canadian River in Texas is one of the few places left where the Arkansas silvery minnow has a very large stretch of river that it can breed and spawn in and continue. So the Canadian River in Texas might not look like much, but it's very crucial to both of these protected species. So we'll jump on to the bison here in the middle. So the bison is in Caprock Canyon State Park. So it's kind of like our little Yellowstone up there, I like to call it. Because we basically what happened is if y'all have ever heard of Charles Goodnight, he's pretty important to Texas history, really American history. Um, Goodnight Trail, the Goodnight Cattle Trail is named after him. So Charles Goodnight was a rancher up in the Rolling Plains. Basically, he used to own all of Paladora Canyon that started down here and pretty much owned like this whole section of the state. Huge ranch back in the 1800s. So Charles Goodnight and his wife noticed that, and he used to be a Texas Ranger too, I believe. But either way, they noticed that when they first started ranching in Texas, when they first came to Texas, there used to be these huge herds of bison. And they noticed by the late 1800s, I guess probably about 1880s or something like that, that the bison were gone. Like they were just disappearing. I mean, there wasn't hardly any left. And they had a handful, I think it was like 10 or 12 individuals or something like that, left on their big ranch. And so they decided they needed to protect them because that was it. And, at the time they didn't know that there were still bison up like in Wyoming and stuff. Obviously not to the number that it used to be. So they put these 10 or 15 individuals basically in a small pasture and they kept them. Well, either way, Charles Goodnight's bison herd ended up getting donated to the state of Texas and it became the official bison herd of Texas. If you didn't know, Texas actually has a state official bison herd. We also have a state official longhorn herd too. Texas Longhorn. But anyway, so this bison got donated, and that became the seed stock for basically the state bison herd of Texas. So fast forward to current times, we now have a lot better understanding of taxonomy and how animals place, and we've now been able to determine that the bison up in the Dakotas and Canada and the northern part of the plains, though we're the same species as the bison we had in Texas and Mexico and Oklahoma on the southern end, they were a little bit genetically different. Ours were a little bit smaller to deal with the warmer temperatures. Their fur wasn't as thick. I think their hump maybe was a little bit smaller. They had some little genetic differences. Still the same species, but they're a subspecies. So we had the southern bison subspecies in Texas. Well, the biologists and the geneticists started doing studies, and basically the only purebred southern bison left can be traced back to like the 10 or 15 individuals that Charles Goodnight and his wife saved from his ranch in the 1800s. So if it wasn't for Charles Goodnight, we would no longer have southern bison, would no longer exist. We'd just have the northern bison strain that was up there from Wyoming and the Dakotas. Uh, but either way, they've released some of these bison out into Cat Rock Canyon State Park, and when I mean they released them, they're no longer like they used to have them like in an enclosure, like a 100-acre pasture or something. They released them, and they're free ranging in the park, which is probably 8, 9, 10,000 acres, something like that. So they're somewhat free ranging bison, but it's a pretty unique story that in the 1800s that a family that helped create the cattle industry and basically was part of driving out the bison to kill them to get rid of the Indians, because he was a Texas Ranger and part of all that, also recognized that something that was such in great abundance was going to disappear unless someone did something, and they protected a subspecies that now is the only they genetics traced it back that would have been, if it wasn't for Goodnight, the bison would have disappeared, the southern strain. Uh, so pretty neat story there. Mule deer, real quick, are on the top right. The rolling plains is where we start losing whitetail and we start getting mule deer, which is more typical of the western United States. That's the deer you see in the western United States. Uh, Mule deer are so aptly named because of their large ears. So when the settlers came out here, they said, "Hey, those deer got big ears like our mules that are pulling our wagon." So they named them mule deer. Biologically, they have big ears because they live in more hot, arid climates that don't have shade, and they're out in the open. And those big ears allow for more blood vessels, which allow for more hot blood to transition with the cooler air and help with hot air exchange, kind of like how a radiator works on a truck. Same thing with elephants. That's why elephants have such large ears to help with blood flow and cool themselves. So mule deer are doing the same thing. That's why they got big ears. All right, so I'm gonna have to hurry it up a little bit to get through our last ecoregions because I'm gonna run out of time. I'm sure I'm talking y'all's ears off, but the next one is going to be this kind of orange color. This is going to be the high plains. It's going to be west of the rolling plains. You got Amarillo up here in Randall and Porter County, and then you got Lubbock down here in Lubbock. Ector and Midland is Odessa and Midland, so if you've ever been out to those cities. The high plains extend into eastern half of New Mexico, eastern half of Colorado, eastern half of Wyoming, and then western parts of Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So the high plain, we're just a small section of the high plains. High plains, short grass, very flat. Old saying up there is that you can watch your dog run away from you for a day and still see it because you can see it's so flat and treeless up there. I also have sayings like you can stand on you can stand and see your neighbor's brake lights from 100 miles away, and if you stand on a tuna can, you can see his brake lights from 200 miles away. I mean, if y'all have never been up to Lubbock, it's pretty flat and treeless. Farming's very dominated, even though it's very arid. It has some of the best soils, not only in Texas, but really in the whole world. It is around Lubbock is the largest cotton patch in the whole, not even in the entire world. Great farming. It's supported by the Ecological Aquifer, which has issues with drainage, but for time's sake, we're not going to get into that today. But one of the unique things about the high plains is playa lakes, and it still has some remnant prairie tracts with some of these species that we think of in the Great Plains. And we'll show pictures of that here in a minute. So start on the bottom left. This is typical high plains, what it historically would have looked like. Very short grass, very flat, very treeless, a lot of exposed dirt between there. But the high plains is the part of the state where we get very cold, very almost subarctic temperatures. I know when we had our cold snap here back in January, when we had the little ice storm, I think the temperatures in Amarillo hit negative 20. They were down in the teens, I think, up in the Panhandle. Negative teens up in the Panhandle. I think they had a high of the single digits for a couple days. So gets very cold up there. Can have very high snowfall events. So very extreme weather patterns. This is a picture of the largest snowfall ever in Texas, and you can see it's halfway up his window sills on the bottom floor. Uh, but so you can get multi-feet snowstorms in the wintertime, and in the summertime you get 120-degree heat and dust storms. So if you want to live in the high plains, you got to be pretty tough because it's pretty tough weather up there. But top right is going to be where we see some of our remnant plains prairie species, high plains species and plants. So there's some what we call sand hills up here. So basically it's areas where you kind of have this sand that basically blew down from the Rocky Mountains and settled in these sand dune fields. And because you can't farm sand dune fields, basically, that's where we still see some of our remnant high plains ecosystems. All right, so the coolest thing, or probably one of the most important thing about the high plains are these playa lakes. And this picture on the left is a great example. So what playa lakes are, they're basically these shallow depressions that are typically dry, but they hold water when they do get rain up there. And because you obviously can't farm in an area that rains like this, you can see they're surrounded by farm fields, but they don't really touch these playa lakes. So just either leave them fallow so they won't farm them, or they'll graze cattle in them. But these playa lakes, there's tens of thousands of them up here around on the high plains, if not hundreds of thousands of them. And they create great habitat for sandhill cranes and waterfowl. So the high plains are a very important winter migration for waterfowl and shorebirds and cranes and geese and ducks. Very important waterfowl destination in this country. Talked about bison already. We do have some lesser prairie chickens, which are a hot button item for endangered species that you can find in a couple of these sand hills up in the high plains. Basically, what's happening with the lesser prairie chicken, which is different than the greater prairie chicken that we have down there at the Atwater Prairie Chicken Refuge down by Houston, if you've ever been down there. The lesser prairie chicken should probably be on the endangered species list. It has been proposed multiple times, probably over the last 15 or 20 years, because there's not but a handful of colonies left in Texas, Kansas, and southeast Colorado. The problem is most of those sand hills where they're found are also oil and gas fields, and when you get oil and gas involved, you get a lot of lobbyists and a lot of landowners and businesses fighting back. So there's a lot of political going back and forth between listing lesser prairie chickens or not. Basically, where it sits right now is the oil companies and these landowners that have these prairie chicken colonies left have agreed with the state governments to try to come up with the management plan to try to protect them, to keep them from going on the endangered species list, so that there's not additional restrictions. Pronghorn antelope can be found in the high plains, fastest land animal in North America, but cannot jump a barbed wire fence. They evolved with no fences on the high plains or no trees, so they do not know how to jump or don't have the capability to do it. But they can outrun a cheetah, because when they evolved during the Ice Age, there was cheetahs in North America, and so they had to evolve to outrun cheetahs. But pronghorn antelope are a pretty neat animal. Fly through our last few ecoregions here, and I always think I'll leave the coolest ones, the best ones for last, and then I run out of time. But here out in far west Texas is going to be the Trans-Pecos or the Chihuahua Desert or the Big Bend region, basically El Paso, west of Midland, Odessa, and we got all our mountain ranges in Texas are out here. So the Trans-Pecos is the Chihuahua Desert, which is one of four major deserts in North America. Very diverse geography, everything from desert floor to high mountains, limestone reefs. Some of the mountains are made out of limestone, some are made from volcanic activity. We have these internal drain areas, mostly rangeland. But the neat thing about the Trans-Pecos and the Chihuahua is we get these western and Mexico subspecies in these sky islands, so up high in these mountains that are above the desert, that you're not going to see any further east or anywhere else in Texas. So what does the Trans-Pecos look like? So when you start, we'll start off on the, we'll go clockwise, or we won't go clockwise. We'll start up here on the top left. On the desert floor, 4,000 to 6,000 feet, you get these Chihuahua Desert, which is recognized by these creosote bushes, which is all these little bushes in here. You go a little bit higher, 6,000 to 7,000 feet, like up around Marfa. You get the Marfa Plateau, which is a high desert grassland. So you can see from this picture here to the one on the right, you get a little bit higher, you get a few more inches of rain, you get more of a grassland. You go a little bit higher. This is an aerial photo of low mountains, so 7,000 to 8,000 feet. You get these low mountains. You can see how these mountains were formed by ancient volcanic activity, because they're basically, you can kind of see the lava flows, how they solidified. It almost looks like water that flowed through there. And then you get up to the very tops of these mountains, and the Chias and the Davis and the Guadalupe and a few other ones. You get these montane woodlands that look kind of reminiscent of New Mexico or parts of Colorado, where you get ponderosa pine, and some, you can even find Douglas fir and a few aspen out in West Texas, believe it or not, in some of the deeper pockets, shaded canyons. The picture on the right is going to be internally drained, so we have some salt basins out here that don't drain anywhere, and they form these big salt basins. But some of the trees you can find up in the mountains, we got left picture here, we got ponderosa pine, which is typical of New Mexico and Colorado mountains. You got alligator juniper, called for its alligator bark. You got Texas madrone, which can be found in other parts of the state, but I think they get their coolest looking and have that neat looking bark out in the Trans-Pecos, kind of salmon colored almost in spots. Then you have some other, we got antelope, we have canyon towhee, which is a western species that makes its appearance out in West Texas. You got a bunch of desert pupfish and darters. That there's a lot of springs out here where these pupfish aren't necessarily endangered because they're common, but they're only found in one spring that might only be an acre or 2, 3 acres big. So if someone was ignorant enough to dump a vat of diesel or something in there, you'd kill out the species because they're only found in one spring. So a lot of pupfish and darters are on the protected species list out here. We've restocked bighorn sheep. That's a whole conservation talk for another day. We've had black bear naturally recolonized from Mexico. And to be honest with you, we now have black bear in South Texas and in the hill country. And this is a picture of a scrub jay eating a cracker that at a picnic site that I stopped at. But so there's some different species. Some more species that you're not going to find anywhere else. These are all, well, not all these. So we do have some trout, possibly. This is a picture of a Rio Grande cutthroat trout. You can't find them in Texas, but we believe that they were historically found in some of these mountain streams out in the Trans-Pecos. So there's been some talk about restocking them. Texas has one species of chipmunk, and this is a picture of it here, and you can only find them in the Guadalupe Mountains. This picture in the middle, even though it just looks like a pine tree, that's actually a Douglas fir that I took up on Guadalupe Peak in the Guadalupe Mountains. And so when you think of Douglas fir, that's the same Douglas fir that you might buy for the Christmas tree that you put in your house for Christmas. You can actually find big ones like this growing out in West Texas, which is pretty, something you don't think of. We've had elk that have pretty much naturally recolonized from New Mexico, even though we do still consider them a non-native species out in West Texas, but that's just from a legality standpoint. Uh, and then this is McKittrick Canyon in the Guadalupe Mountains on the right, and you can see the maples and the aspens and the cottonwoods turning. So, very pretty part of the state. All right, so we got 3 more ecoregions to get through in 9 minutes, so we're going to really boogie because I know y'all want to get out of here. So the middle one is going to be the hill country or the Edwards Plateau. This is that blue region in the center part of the state. And you got San Antonio, San Marcos, Austin here on the side. Limestone Plateau, a lot of urbanization issues, a lot of ranching, shallow soils, very rocky, very limestone. But because it's a limestone, we have the Edwards Aquifer, which creates this karst geography. So the water sinks in and it comes back out as these spring-fed springs and these spring-fed rivers. And it's created a lot of these Texas endemics because we kind of have these kind of mountain springs and rivers in this part of the state that are disjunct from anywhere else. So we have a lot of species that you can't find outside of Texas, and they're only found in the Edwards Plateau. Historically, it would have been more of a savanna. Now it's more of a woodland. So picture on the left is going to be what typical Edwards Plateau, oak, juniper, woodland. Historically, there would have been a lot more open. You read some historical settlers accounts. Where this part of the state has a lot of Germans and Austrians settled here, and the reason why they settled here was this part of the state, because of the rolling hills and grasslands, reminded them of the Alps in Germany and Austria where they came from. Obviously, now it's more of a woodland. This is a picture of karst geography. We got a lot of sinkholes and caves. We have these granite uprisings, so enchanted rocks. So we have these huge blocks of granite. Enchanted rock is a great example of it. But the karst geography with the limestone makes these Guadalupe River, Blanco, Pedernales, who makes these clean, fast-flowing, spring-fed rivers. And what that does is it creates these Texas endemics such as Guadalupe bass, which is pictured here, which is only found in these spring-fed rivers in the central parts of the state. We have some other species, protected species like this fishhook cactus, golden cheek warbler, which nest in these cedar juniper trees you find in the central part of the state. But this picture is all Texas endemics that can be found in this karst geography, spring-fed Edwards Aquifer Springs. There's like 20 or 30 little beetles and arthropods and spiders, and they don't even have common names because they go down in a cave and this biologist says, oh, here's a new spider we've never seen before, and they give it a scientific name. We have these blind salamanders that live down in the underground in these caves that never come up. So they have these external gills. They have no eyes. They're albino, translucent. Texas wild rice, darters. So we have a lot of cave and aquifer Texas endemic species. So Edwards Plateau, very unique to Texas, one of our most unique ecological regions. So second to last is going to be the Tampico shrublands or the South Texas plains. So south of the Edwards Plateau, south of San Antonio, Corpus is over here in Nueces, Laredo's here in Webb, Brownsville's down here in Cameron. It doesn't technically go to the coast. There's a little sliver of what we call the coastal prairie, which is our last ecoregions. But basically, in a nutshell, the southern Texas plains is our tropical, subhumid, arid ecoregion. A lot of ranching, keen ranches down here. Warm winters. This is where we have a lot of our tropical vegetation, our tropical birds. And because of that, we have a very high and distinct diversity for Texas, and not only for Texas, but the lower 48, because a lot of these plants and animal species reach their northern limit in the South Texas plains. So here's just a typical picture of your Tampico shrubland. So, everything down there either bites, stings, or cuts you. But you can see lots of cactus, lots of thorns. Believe it or not, historically, this would actually been a lot more grassland. And we actually had pronghorn antelope down here like you think of in Colorado and up in the high plains of Texas. And the Keene Ranch actually shot the last antelope in 1920 or 1930 down here. So I mean, you don't. That's really not that long ago. But here's all some Texas endemic species that you're not going to find out anywhere else in the lower 48 outside of Texas. Now, they all go down into Mexico, but you have the Texas indigo snake, which its favorite food is the western diamondback rattlesnake. As you can see it eating, very large, very colorful snake. Groovebill Annie here on the left. Green jay on the right. South Texas is a very popular destination for worldwide birding because of the species you can see there. You have the Texas tortoise, gopher tortoise, only found in Texas, and then a whole bunch of shrubs and palms and a whole list of things. All right, so in our last 3 minutes is going to be our last ecoregion, which I always say I think one of the best ones for last due to its highest diversity. Maybe not the most pretty, but it's going to be our coastal plains, which start here in Beaumont, go west to Houston, hits its high point here in Waller County up around Hempstead, where it's about 100 miles wide, and then it tapers all the way down through Victoria and Corpus down to Brownsville to where it's just a 10 to 20 mile little sliver along the coast. But historically, you would have had large woodlands along the major rivers, and then you had your tallgrass prairie inland, so just like the Blackland Prairie, very similar. And then you would have had your salt prairie, salt marsh, and then eventually your Gulf bays and your oceans. A lot of farmland, a lot of urbanization, a lot of petrochemical, probably one of our most altered ecoregions, but still just incredibly biodiversity. The Laguna Madre is going to be this sliver of water down here between Corpus and Brownsville on the bay side of Padre Island. The Laguna Madre is a hypersaline ecosystem, which basically means it's more saltier than the ocean because no freshwater inflows come into it. And you might think, well, that sounds like nothing would grow there, but it actually grows a lot of what we call eelgrass and other marine vegetation, which is very important for shrimp and redfish and a lot of wintering waterfowl. So the Laguna Madre is one of the most highly productive marine ecosystems, not only in the U.S. and North America, but around the world. Very, very important, Laguna Madre. So here's just some examples of what it looks like in the coastal prairie. So you start off, you have your Spartina grasslands. So we don't really have coral reefs in our bays. We have these Spartina grasslands, which actually the marine biologists say is the second highest marine ecosystem in the world behind coral reefs as far as number of species you can find living in here. So these Spartina grasslands or cordgrass grasslands that stay submerged are very important for shrimp and crabs and blue crabs and redfish and flounder, all are important commercial shellfish and finfish. Eelgrass is what you find in the Laguna Madre. That's what all the ducks feed on. This is Matagorda Beach here. So you got your sand dunes. You get a little higher inland. You get your tall grass prairie. This is what you call the salt grass prairie. Sometimes you'll hear people call it that. This is that area where the ocean doesn't get to unless you have a hurricane, but the plants here are adapted to growing in salt water. And then you have these Columbia bottomlands that you see around Freeport and Lake Jackson with these very large live oak trees, which are very important to point out because the Columbia bottomlands along that Brazos, Colorado River bottom down there south of Houston around Freeport is the only spot in the western Gulf Coast where trees actually grow all the way up to the Gulf of Mexico. So what happens is when these birds are migrating south from the eastern side of North America, they come across the Gulf and they need these Columbia bottomlands south of Houston to refurbish themselves and basically feed themselves back from starvation after they flew 1,000 miles and haven't stopped and went across the ocean to refuel their migration further south. So a lot of songbirds utilize this bottomlands. So just, we got skimmers and a bunch of shorebirds, ducks, pintails, redheads, orchard orioles, a good example of these neotropical songbirds that need these bottomland live oak woodlands that you find along the Gulf Coast to continue their migration down to Central and South America. Sea turtles are always a popular topic. We've done a good job with sea turtle recovery here in Texas. Prairie chickens, like I said, we gray water prairie chickens. They used to estimate there was like 10 to 15 million prairie chickens. Now there's like 100. But probably one of the most unique ones to kind of wrap this up is this blue crab. This isn't a blue crab, even though it's blue in color. It's actually a land crab. So I never knew this till I lived in Palacios after college on the coast. Texas actually has land crabs, and they can live 10 to 15 miles inland from the Gulf, from the bays, from the salt water. And the only time these land crabs in Texas need salt water is when they spawn, when they're reproducing. The rest of the time, they live in these kind of salt grasslands 10 to 15 miles inland, and you never know they're there. I had no idea we had land crabs in Texas. So kind of cool and neat looking. And they're pretty big. That's the bottom of a 64 quart cooler. So, it's about 12, it's 12 to 16 inches across. And then obviously you can't talk about the golf. Someone asked if they are delicious. Uh, I don't know, and I don't know if there would be a lot of meat on the land crab because the one claw, I mean, the claw is pretty big. I don't know. I never heard of anyone eating them. In fact, that's the only one I saw, and someone I walked with caught it. I will say it did have a pretty off-putting smell to it. It had a pretty unique odor to it, to say the least. So I don't know. I'm sure if you were up to it, I'm sure you could eat it. I'm sure it wouldn't kill you. I don't know how good it would taste. Uh, but lastly, you can't talk about the Gulf without talking about our high diversity of fishes. So redfish, obviously an important commercial fish, both from commercial and recreational sport fishing. Same thing with flounder. But we have a lot of other unique fish. So this on the bottom right is a toadfish. It's very ugly looking. It's very ugly looking, but it can eat oysters. And then we have a blenny here. Okay. Blenny here, and then we have a lot of other fish. So with that being said, I'm over time, so I will stop.
Thank you, Matthew. Wow,
Yep.
we learned a lot today from you. Your voice must be expired by now. We
I will
appreciate you
say
so
if y'all
much.
if y'all really do like learning about this, go Google just EPA Ecological Regions of Texas, and it'll pull up this map here, and that dwells into this a lot deeper. They got about 1,000-page booklet that goes over all the ecological regions. And as you can see, they divide it out between about 50 sub-eco regions. So if you want to delve into it, you can.
Does anybody have any questions from? I don't see any questions, but I see a lot of positive feedback in the chat.
Yeah, thank y'all.
So,
I appreciate it. Someone always says now I want to go travel, so I think that's a good goal of me with this presentation.
yes, you certainly inspired us. Okay, so with that being said, I am just going to go through a few housekeeping items that we need to discuss. Reminder, record your hours in VMS. The first deadline is approaching, which is February 24th for the January 10th class meeting. So make sure you get that in VMS. There was a response from Melissa, for those of you that were inquiring about volunteering at gift shops, she said they cannot be used in VMS volunteer hours. So please do not report those. The next class will be February 24th. That's this Wednesday at 7 p.m. It's a Zoom meeting, and Virginia will be sending out the Zoom link for that. We ask that you please post your key takeaways in the chat for today's meeting. And our hike today is at Spring Creek Nature Preserve. And please refer to the email that was sent out with the Google Map location. If you all want to carpool, it's highly recommended. Parking is limited. And meet at the Hobby Lobby on Sawdust Let's just say 11:40 for those of you that want to carpool. And for those of you that are just driving there, please do not park in the sports or baseball, softball field location. Um, Dress according to the hike, shoes, closed toe shoes, sunscreen, water, all that great stuff. And one final thing, Abigail, we noticed you're on the meeting today. Thank you. We asked that we need your phone number. So please provide that to us either through email or in the chat. So anybody have any questions? I'll stay on the chat other for the next few minutes and then we'll close it out and we'll see you out at the nature trail. Thanks so much for attending. And thank you, Matthew.
You're welcome.